Hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was a worst royal engagement I ever did, a royal wedding I ever did. And I travelled the world with him, and I did really enjoy working with him. But, you know, now I really don't care if I ever see him again, because the way he's behaved towards the king and our queen and his brother and his sister. And this is the story of Harry, though, you know, ever since he decided to leave the royal family and go his own way in the United States. And he's just behaving, I think, sometimes appallingly. Certainly some of the things he said about members of the royal family, certainly, and Camilla and Catherine and his brother. I think Meghan as well, referring to that Oprah Winfrey interview about, you know, the royals are racist in many ways because they questioned the colour of Archie's skin. It was, yeah, a bit stupid. And also, as I say earlier, you know, it was a little bit insulting, you know, I mean, the thing about when Harry's ever spoken about the Queen, he speaks with absolute love and respect.
Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's wedding was miserable and a disaster.
He's a prince of the realm, although he's decided to keep the title but not do any work. The king is not frightened to speak out. He does his research, he gets his facts in order, and he says it, and he's not frightened of the criticism.
For 50 years, Arthur Edwards lived by one simple rule: say nothing and you'll see everything. And oh, did that rule take him places no one else ever reached. Not because he pushed, not because he demanded, but because he earned it. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. He understood something most people never do: the quiet code of royal life. Be close, but never intrusive. Be present, but never performative. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was loyalty. And that loyalty opened doors no shouting ever could. That's why this story doesn't begin with chaos or scandal or screaming headlines. It begins with something far more unsettling: a silence that finally cracked.
You just don't do that with families. You know, your families are the most important thing in your life, and you just do everything to keep the family together and in peace. And I imagine the king's sort of unhappy with Harry being around people where he could learn stories and hear gossip and then put it in either his next book or his next podcast or his next radio or TV interview.
Because when Arthur finally felt something was wrong, it wasn't during a fight or a leak or some explosive moment. No, it happened on a wedding day, a day that should have been glowing with warmth, buzzing with emotion, humming with that familiar royal magic. But instead, something felt off. Not emotional, not chaotic, just cold, calculated, distant. Arthur had seen everything in his lifetime: joyous ceremonies, stiff ones, awkward ones, tense ones. He knew nerves. He knew protocol. He knew when a family was strained but still standing together. This was none of that. This felt like something else entirely.
Getting treatment, he was still working on his boxes and stuff. I imagine she's doing the same. I imagine she has her staff, you know, planning things and events and also projects that she's heavily involved in. So I imagine, even though we're not seeing her, she's not making public appearances, I imagine she's still pretty busy doing that. And yeah, and I think she's just an incredible woman in my view. She not only a mother and rearing three beautiful children, she's a great member of the royal family. She's a hard-working member of the royal family. She's a great photographer, I have to say that. I must say her pictures get better and better, and she shares them with us all.
From the very beginning of the day, the atmosphere wasn't welcoming. It wasn't inclusive, it wasn't warm, it felt managed. Not for the people inside the room, but for the image being crafted for the world outside it. Access quietly shrank, distance quietly grew. Faces that had been there for decades were suddenly held back, while unfamiliar ones were ushered forward. And to someone like Arthur, who reads rooms for a living, this wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate. This was a message, and messages like that don't get sent accidentally.
Because, you know, he's just come back from a long illness. I mean, we didn't see him for months, and he's been really putting a big shift in, you know. I mean, he's working every day this week, and because of now the election, you know, a lot of it's going to be cancelled. I hope some of the big events go ahead. I hope that, you know, we get to Normandy with him and Troop in the Colour, you know, the big events in London, his official birthday.
That's when it hit him. That proximity, once given freely, was now something to be controlled. That relationships built over years could be sidelined without explanation. And for the first time in his entire career, Arthur felt something he had never felt at a royal wedding before. Not disappointment, not confusion, exclusion. The day moved forward anyway, polished to perfection for television screens. To viewers at home, it looked like a fairy tale straight out of a storybook, but inside those walls, it felt like a production. Boundaries everywhere, rules everywhere, and the priorities were painfully clear. The people who had always been there weren't part of the plan anymore. That's when Arthur understood. Something fundamental had shifted.
I think it was a bit, well, I think it was a little bit insolent. I think it was a little bit, I mean, it was written obviously by a lawyer, American lawyer, by the sounds of the way it's written, who doesn't understand quite how it works here. You know, when the Queen says you can't do something, you can't do it. And that's it. I mean, she's not saying it because she's being spiteful to Harry, who she absolutely adores, but it's because it's the law. It's part of the Companies Act, and you can't do that. And you certainly can't use a royal title for commercial gain.
This wasn't about one wedding or one bad moment. It was about a decision already made. A decision to treat tradition like a backdrop instead of a bond. To treat access like leverage. To treat trust as optional. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because weddings don't just celebrate love, they expose intent. Arthur didn't explode. He didn't complain. He didn't lash out. He did what he had always done best. He watched. And in that watching, something settled in his chest. This wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the quiet end of something old. Not an ending marked by anger or drama, but by withdrawal. And when trust collapses quietly, the damage lasts longer. That's where this story truly begins.
Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's wedding. It happened 4 years ago today. And I think we are all still like Zara Phillips, sitting back in our pews wondering, now what's happening now? I just love that gift from the royal wedding, and it really just captured the entire spirit of kind of what happened to that wedding and just kind of basically the disaster that Harry and Meghan's marriage really has been in terms of their time in the public spotlight between, their time as royals and then Mexit and then post-Mexit life. It's really been one long train wreck for Harry and Meghan. And really we can see this almost from the jump as soon as they got engaged. And it really set up, some of the things they said, some of the things they did, really set them up for kind of failure within the monarchy. And now they're kind of failing post-monarchy as well. They have all these deals lined up and yet nothing really to show for it.
Royal weddings are meant to be shared, not just with millions watching at home, but with the people who quietly carry the institution year after year. The photographers, the aides, the courtiers, the family members who understand the weight and rhythm of royal life. They're usually part of the moment, not obstacles to manage. But this time was different. Very different. From early on, it was clear visibility was being restricted in ways Arthur had never experienced before. Sight lines tightened, distances widened, angles were controlled, movement was limited. The setup itself created separation, not by accident, by design. To an outsider, this might sound technical, but to Arthur, it screamed distrust. Instead of openness, there was avoidance. Instead of cooperation, obstruction. Moments that were traditionally shared, arrivals, processions, connections, were minimized or redirected. And the result wasn't privacy, it was exclusion. And exclusion always sends a message. The people who normally document history were suddenly treated like problems instead of witnesses. Not for security reasons, not for chaos, but because control had taken priority. This wasn't how royal weddings worked. Arthur had seen pressure before. He'd seen families under strain. He'd seen royals uncomfortable with attention. But even then, there was understanding, a shared duty, a recognition that some moments belong not to individuals, but to the institution and the public it serves. What replaced that understanding felt colder. Management. Every step pre-planned, every interaction filtered, every angle calculated not to include, but to avoid. To Arthur, it felt less like a wedding and more like a set, a place where spontaneity was the enemy. This wasn't about hiding from cameras, it was about deciding who deserved access. And that decision didn't stop with photographers. Guests noticed it too. Long-serving people were quietly pushed aside, while unfamiliar faces moved forward. Proximity was no longer earned by loyalty, it was granted by usefulness. Arthur understood immediately what this meant. If the most symbolic act of unity could be turned into a controlled production, then the future would follow the same rulebook. Control over trust, image over relationship, distance over inclusion. And while television sold the illusion beautifully, something irreversible had already happened behind the scenes. I think it was the Queen's merry bandeau and then Prince Hazer being in on it with the Queen turning around and saying, "Look, Meg's being a bit of a bridezilla here." Prince are reportedly saying what Megsy wants, Megsy gets. Like this wedding we know was an absolute disaster pretty much from the start. But this royal photographer is pretty much, confirming Arthur didn't need to say a word, he'd already seen enough, and if the wedding was the first signal, everything that followed would only make the pattern impossible to ignore. Because control doesn't stop once it works, it expands. Arthur didn't need anyone to spell it out for him. When you've stood inside history long enough, you know when something real is being replaced by something staged. Control always masquerades as professionalism at first, but to someone like Arthur, the difference is obvious. Real moments breathe, performances suffocate, and this wedding suffocated. It wasn't messy, it wasn't loud, it was over-polished, over-managed, and that's always a warning sign. Because when everything looks perfect, it usually means someone worked very hard to make sure nothing authentic slipped through. He'd spent decades watching royal moments unfold naturally. Even the most formal ceremonies still had cracks of humanity. A missed step, a shared laugh, a look exchanged without thinking. Those moments aren't mistakes, they're proof of life. But here, none of that. Everything moved like clockwork, too smooth, too rehearsed, as if deviation itself had been banned. The day didn't feel reverent, it didn't feel joyful, it felt tense under the shine, like everyone knew they were part of something tightly choreographed and any misstep would be unwelcome. Viewers later said they felt uneasy without knowing why. That's because they sensed it too. The smiles were held, the gestures felt practiced, the joy felt absent at the moment. I mean, has you been married 7 years now? Is it 7-year anniversary? Yeah, so 7 years. This week was their 7th. Do you remember that? You must remember. Where were you on the you were there in Windsor? Oh, I was there. Hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was I thought, well, was it? Well, I can tell you now. It was the worst royal engagement I ever did. A royal wedding I ever did. That's not something Arthur says lightly. This is a man who's covered generations of royalty. He noticed how tradition was cherry-picked. Certain elements were loudly embraced while others were quietly stripped away. The rituals that usually anchor a royal wedding, the continuity, the unspoken cues, were reframed to suit a different story. This wasn't evolution, it was rebranding. And rebranding an institution this old isn't harmless. It tells everyone watching that the past is optional and the rules are flexible. That message hits hardest for the people who live by those rules their entire lives. That wasn't just a bad day on the job. That was a worldview being announced. And once that worldview takes hold, relationships change permanently. Trust erodes quietly. Access becomes transactional. Proximity turns into risk. Arthur didn't need drama to understand it, because when performance replaces reality, the ending is usually the same. Control always comes with a cost. You just don't notice until you've seen the opposite. Arthur had covered countless royal weddings. They weren't perfect, but they were human. Even difficult ones felt communal. This one didn't. Both Prince Charles, King Charles's weddings, I did William's wedding, I did Andrew's wedding, I did Sophie and Edward. You know, I mean, they were lovely occasions, but that today I couldn't get out of Windsor quick enough. I promise you that. At other weddings, once the ceremony ended, the space softened. People relaxed, conversations flowed, everyone knew the boundaries, and because of that, trust existed. Here, the opposite happened. As soon as the vows were done, the space closed down. Movement was restricted, interaction became conditional. What used to happen naturally now required permission. Nothing felt shared, everything felt supervised. And that was new. Royal life had always relied on an unspoken agreement. Discretion was mutual. You didn't record everything. You didn't repeat everything. You didn't weaponize access. Trust wasn't demanded. It was assumed. It was difficult times. I have to say though, you know, that first year of Meghan, that working with her on the road, I mean, you know, we went all over the country. I mean, she was incredible. I mean, I thought she was, and I was saying this, you know, I thought she was a great asset to the family. And I kept asking the palace if we could have a meeting with her. You know, the people covered the royals to have a meeting with Meghan like we did with Catherine. But that assumption disappeared. What replaced it wasn't protection. It was control. Who could be close? Who could hear? Who might later remember something wrong? The pressure didn't come from outside scrutiny. It came from inside, from a desire to manage every detail and every narrative, and that changes everything. Politeness replaced ease. Caution replaced warmth. And when people start monitoring themselves constantly, relationships don't deepen. They shrink. And I don't agree with it. You know, I think Harry's chosen to quit the royal family. That's fair enough. Everybody should determine what they do in life. But if you're doing that, then you quit. You don't take what you want out of it and leave the rest. You can't, as they say, have your cake and eat it. Arthur recognized this pattern instantly. In families, in workplaces, in life. When control becomes the goal instead of a tool, things don't explode. They go cold. And cold lingers. Nothing exposes reality faster than children. Not what's said about them, but how they're handled. Royal children have always been bridges. They soften tensions. They connect generations. That's why what came next unsettled people like Arthur more than any headline ever could. And then when the baby was born, when Archie was born, that was another, in my view, a disaster because I knew we was not going to get a picture of it. This time, everything was guarded, delayed, filtered. To the public, it was sold as privacy. To insiders, it felt like narrative control. There's a difference. Privacy protects children. different. Control uses them. Arthur had seen real privacy before. What disturbed him was inconsistency. One rule today, another tomorrow. Openness when useful, silence when inconvenient. Baby was. Harry's baby Archie was almost teething before we found out it was born. The wall didn't just block cameras, it blocked people, grandparents, cousins, shared moments. And once that wall goes up, it becomes normal. Anyone questioning it is treated as a threat instead of family. That's not privacy, that's isolation. Prince of Wales, Prince Charles will be seething. It would be so unfair.